Can we? I know we're about 20 minutes in or so to the conversation, but can we get a definition on exactly what microfinance is?
It's a really good question. So the easiest definition is small loans given to poor people with the idea that they will use those loans to start businesses and launch themselves out of poverty. Right. So a loan as kind of an anti-poverty solution with the idea that that loan is used to invest in a business and then profits are used to fund everything that a poor person might need, whether it's education, housing, water, etc. The reason I say that's kind of the easy definition is, in fact, it's much more complicated at this point, where there's around 200 million people who take out microfinance loans internationally. There isn't a single definition. And so everyone in Sierra Leone, I walked into multiple offices, all of whom said they were doing microfinance loans, but the details of what those loans looked like varied greatly. So it could be anywhere from a loan that was specifically for an agricultural product or to a loan that was for an SUV. And they both called it microfinance. So essentially now, microfinance in poorer countries means a loan to a poor person. There isn't a very kind of stringent definition, but the way we think about it often in our kind of more Western imagination is an anti-poverty loan specifically given for business with the idea that that loan will lift people out of poverty. And a lot of studies have shown that actually a lot of the loans aren't invested in business, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of that is that the conditions don't actually allow for that to happen. When you're paying such high interest rates, it's really, really hard to invest in a successful business. And the loans are instead used for kind of day-to-day costs or for, paying off another debt, another microfinance debt. A lot of loans are used to pay off another debt, and they start to look a lot more like payday loans than anti-poverty loans.
And even the payday loan industry, I mean, let's talk domestically for a little bit, is pretty underregulated, to put it extremely mildly. Maybe I'm being a little too generous with it. I think because everything we're talking about here kind of lives in poverty. And until you actually have to deal with it, because I'm not going to lie, I found myself in a desperate situation where an opportunity came my way, and the only thing I could do was take out a payday loan for my business, right? But to your point, the return you have to have business wise, if one little thing goes wrong, and that's ultimately what happened. We used it for a tour. We were promised so much money each night. We didn't get it, so you're in default before you know it, and you can't get out of these things. The interest you pay is pretty astronomical.
Yeah.
But it feels like the feeling around it is, well, don't take it out if you can't pay it back. And it's like, oh no, I've paid it back 5 times.
Totally.
That's not the point. The point is that, I don't have family that can just drop me a few grand for me to realize my dreams. Right? Not everybody has that.
I've heard, I hear that a lot when I talk to people about microfinance, even now when I describe the conditions. The most expensive loan that I found was 250% annual interest. And even when I describe those conditions, people will say, oh, well, if those, people are rational economic actors, if those conditions don't work for them, they can just decide not to take out the loan. But of course, these loans are specifically pitched to poor people. And we're talking about whether that's here in the US, payday lending, or in Sierra Leone. They're not the poorest people in Sierra Leone, but this is one of the poorest countries in the world. And so the women that I met were taking out the loans because they felt like they had no other choice, right? There was no other way to access money. They weren't well connected. To your point, they didn't have connections to, other people in the community who had money. And so this was the way that they got cash. That's how they understood these loans. These loans were not understood by these women as a way to build business. They learned how to use that language, that narrative of business in order to get the loans, but they really understood understood the loans as a way to kind of get by, right? And that was happening at the same time that things in Sierra Leone were getting more and more expensive. And again, there's a parallel here to the US. People take out payday loans for things like healthcare, for housing, in addition to small businesses, as you mentioned. And it's the same thing in Sierra Leone. The women that I met were taking out the loans to pay for their children's school fees, to pay for transportation as the cost of gas went up. And so this notion of, oh, well, people are just rational economic actors. They can decide whether or not to enter the market, right? That's like the very kind of basic premise of a market-based society. These women had no other choice. And so they were aware of the risks they were taking, which included potentially going to the police or jail if they didn't pay back the loans. But they really felt like, I live in a society in which none of my services are paid for by the government or offered by the government. This is the way that I need to get by. And I think there's certainly a very strong parallel, and a lot of people have argued this, between microfinance and payday lending, especially when it comes to regulation, as you noted. And there's a very, very limited regulation of microfinance none at an international level. And at a national level, it's kind of up to governments to do it on their own. And as you can imagine, in a place like Sierra Leone that is overwhelmed, it's very difficult for the Sierra Leonean government to suddenly come up with a regulatory body for microfinance, right, when they're suddenly flooded with new microfinance companies. And one of the people that I met with there, who works for the Central Bank of Sierra Leone, I asked him, why don't you regulate microfinance companies? Why don't you at least monitor interest rates? And he said, oh, we've been told by the IMF that we need to have a deregulated financial market here in order to.
Whoa.
And he said this multiple times because I wanted to make sure that I understood him correctly and that I understood what he was saying. And he said, yeah, his understanding was we are not able to regulate interest rates, including of microfinance loans, because the IMF has told us that we need to have a deregulated financial economy here in Sierra Leone. So I think the other thing that's underlying the question that you asked is this notion of difference, right? The notion that poor people just kind of can survive on higher price loans, right? It's just kind of, it is what it is. And that's
You knew
just,
what you were getting into.
you knew what you
weren't
were getting
anything
into. Yeah, exactly. Like, at least you have an option that's better than nothing. And I think what I found throughout reporting this book, and also just through work on international development more generally, is we really expect poor people, whether they're poor people here in the US or poor people internationally, to live differently than the rest of us do, right? And Muhammad Yunus really framed this in a positive way. Like, he framed, the idea that poor people were almost like magical in their ability to take a loan and make a business, right? This kind of like, again, this emancipatory language, this notion of, wow, you can give a woman a high price loan and still she can create a business and still lift herself out of poverty, this kind of like fairy tale notion, right? And so that's a really positive framing, but it's still seeing women, poor people, poor women, as different than the rest of us, right? It's assuming that they don't need the same things that the rest of us need, that they don't need reasonably priced credit, that they don't need functioning state systems. And I think it's throughout the process of researching and writing the book, the thing that really came out was the notion of, a positive difference is still a difference. We're still viewing poor people as different than the rest of us. And so we say, oh, we want to offer them the same financial products that the rest of us do. That was the framing, right? If they have the same financial products that we do, then they'll be able to thrive like we do. Except the caveat there is that those financial products were actually very different than the products that other people have access to in terms of rates and other conditions. So I think this notion of like, oh, well, it is what it is, and at least it's something, really underlies both the payday loan and payday lending industry here and microfinance internationally.
Well,